Hi, I'm Sally Whitney, and I'm very grateful to Writer Unboxed for giving me the opportunity to tell you about my new novel, When Enemies Offend Thee. When Enemies Offend Thee is a thriller with a female protagonist. It's the story of a woman determined to get justice for herself on her own when police refused to charge the man who sexually assaulted her. She devises a lot of different plans, and when each one of them tends to fail, she moves on to the next one until eventually she finds herself walking a thin, dangerous line between justice and vengeance and asking herself who she really is and if she can actually be the person that she wants to be. To give you a little bit of a taste of the book, I'm going to read to you the first paragraph. A rush of frigid air through the cluttered antique shop announced that the front door was suddenly ajar, even though the store wasn't scheduled to open for weeks. Clementine looked up from the box of oil paintings she was unpacking. Surely the door was locked, but maybe not. A thud on the wooden floor was unmistakably the sound of heavy boots. Clementine laid aside the painting she was holding and peered around a pair of bookshelves that were temporarily stranded in the middle of the floor. The shop was crammed with 1- and 2-drawer tables, wobbly ladder-back chairs, Victorian desks, miscellaneous lamps and mirrors, plus stacks of boxes yet to be unpacked. The thud sounded again as a man stepped from behind a large Empire bureau. Tall and heavy-set, he reminded Clementine of an aging football player whose muscle had turned to flab. Thin hair combed away from his face made his forehead seem overly large. "Clementine?" he asked. I started writing When Enemies Offend Thee in 2012, and it took me about 4 years to write it. I had two main ideas when I started writing. The first was to ask myself and the reader, how far would you actually go to right a wrong or correct an injustice that had been done to you? There's a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche that says, "In revenge and in love, woman is more barbarous than man." That quote stuck in my mind for a long time, and in fact, the original working title for this novel was More Barbarous Than Man. But then there was another part to the idea, and that was, if you go to the edge, even if you don't go over, can you really ever get back? In other words, the question of redemption came into play, and I wanted to pursue that as well. The second idea involved place. I wanted to write about a small southern mill town that had lost its mill, the factory that had been for more than a century, its major employer was gone. This has happened all over the United States, but I'm most familiar with the South, so I wanted to write about the phenomenon there. I had explored small town mill culture in detail when the mill was actually still functioning in my first novel, Surface and Shadow. So this was the dark progression of the culture, what happens to the town's economy, its people, even to its overall appearance when the mill, the factory, is gone. I did a lot of research for this novel, and one of the most different and interesting things that I researched, I guess, was North Carolina root medicine. At one point in her quest for justice, Clementine decides that she is going to explore the power of spells and hexes in order to get justice for herself, to make sure that the man who assaulted her pays for what he's done. In doing the research, a lot of interesting reading about various spells and hexes and testaments that many of them actually worked. So you can be sure that some of those show up in the book. Writer Unboxed asked me to share some of the techniques that I used in writing the novel, and also how I was able to get past those inevitable patches when you're writing a novel and you just think, I might as well quit. Nothing's going right. Why am I doing this in the first place? One of the techniques I used that I found extremely helpful was the idea of a scene map. A scene map is actually a table with columns and rows, and the first column contains the page numbers of the scene in the book. Second column contains the date and the place where the scene takes place. The third column describes briefly what happens in the scene. The fourth column gives a brief reason for why the scene is there. What does it do? Does it advance the plot? Does it help develop character? What's its reason for being there? And then the fourth column asks what is missing in the scene, what is lacking. So I find this technique particularly helpful in analyzing scenes, because you're forced to look at the scenes in relationship to each other. And also, when you start asking, what does this scene do? It's pretty clear if the scene doesn't do anything. If the people characters are just passing the time of day, it becomes pretty evident pretty quickly. And then a second reason that I think that this technique is really helpful, almost invaluable, is that it quickly lets you know when and where each scene happened. Because for me, inevitably, when I'm about 2/3 of the way through, I'll start thinking, well, when was it that they did that, and where were they? And if you can just look at your scene map and you immediately know, oh, well, that was back in September, and they were out of town when they did it, or they were in Clementine's house. So I find this technique really helpful. As for those moments that we all have when you just think, well, everything's going wrong, why am I writing this novel in the first place? What got me through those moments was my concern for the characters, particularly for the protagonist, Clementine. She had been through so much that I wanted to make sure that her voice was heard. It deserved to be heard. So that kept me going, and readers may agree with what she has to say, or they may not, but I wanted to be sure that she was heard. So I hope that you will want to find out what Clementine has to say, see whether you agree with it or not. When Enemies Offend Thee is available on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com from the publisher, and when independent bookstores reopen, which I hope will be soon, you can get it there by request. You can also learn more about the book on my website, SallyWhitney.com, where you can get in touch with me by email if you have questions about the book, or I also have an occasional newsletter, and I would love it if you would join that community. So thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you again, Writer Unboxed.